Last time on Mishaco, quickly other NATO members would take note. While the AR-15 really wasn't produced outside of America by many people, especially early on, the 223 cartridge was picked up. H&K would do a version of the roller lock gun for that round, is the HK33. In the late 60s, FN would start working on an FN produced gun, originally the FN CAL, later the FNC, to use it. SiG in Switzerland, Beretta in Italy would begin work on a 223 gun as well, first together and then separately. And so you start to see it really spread. People really liked this concept, this idea, including Soviet Russia. So we looked at the AK early on. This is the AK-74. Now with it, we really skipped one step, the AKM. For a detailed history, you guessed it by now, we have a video really going into that. The AK Type 3, the milled gun, was, you know, it was a good production for the 50s, but by the 60s and 70s, it was becoming more time-consuming, more labor-consuming to produce. So they switched to the AKM, which was built on a stamped receiver. They also went to a lighter barrel. They put on a muzzle brake to help make the gun more manageable in full auto. They also put palm swells on the handguard so it could be easier grabbed on full auto. They changed the buttstock to make it more straight inline, again to be more manageable in full auto. So they were trying to improve the AK platform to make it a better gun in full automatic. Also cheaper and faster to produce. Now the AKM was still chambered for 7.62 and it was a very successful, and even today is a very successful rifle. But Russia took note of the M16's performance and the 223's performance in the early days of Vietnam. We're talking very early on, 62, 63. They acquired some of the cartridges and they tried reverse engineering them. And then they tried reverse engineering a version of 7.62 but for a smaller diameter, a 5.6 millimeter. And this all eventually led to the Russian 5.45 by 39 millimeter and the AK-74. They would work on making this from the late 60s and officially adopt it in 1974, with production beginning a couple of years later. Mechanically, the AK-74 is the same. Long stroke gas piston, rotating bolt, feeds from detachable 30 round magazines. Early on, the mags would be made from a fiberglass, AG4, often called Bakelite material. Later, they would go to a true polymer, but they weren't really using metal mags in Russia. Metal cost, well, steel, and it also added weight. Other nations like Romania and Poland might use metal mags in the AK-74, but Russia never would. It would have all the same updates as the AKM to help it in full auto. They would also install this very large and also very effective muzzle brake, again, just to check recoil. So now Russia too is going away from the heavier and slower 7.62 30 caliber projectile and going down to a faster, high velocity 22 caliber 5.45 round. So they went with this, and these are still in service today, usually in a little more updated versions, but they're still in service in Russia today. And these obviously would spawn a very large family. Now, 5.45 was just starting to spread throughout the Warsaw Pact in the 80s when communism began to falter and then fumble and fail in 1989. So you don't see near as many 5.45 caliber AKs spread around the world as you would the 7.62 This isn't a condemnation of the 5.45 cartridge. In fact, it's very much on par with 5.56. You might argue 5.56 has a little bit of an edge, but realistically they're both very comparable, and that's the problem. after the end of communism, there was no need for two extremely similar cartridges on the world market, and since the U.S. quote-unquote won the Cold War, its cartridge, 5.56, was what spread first throughout Europe, and then pretty much the rest of the world. But this definitely shows that Russia took note. They made their AK cheaper and easier to produce, easier to use in full auto, and eventually went to a small cartridge. Now our next gun here really is going to represent a whole host of guns. This is the Armalite AR-180, which is the semi-auto version of the AR-18. Now I'm bringing this out because this really is what inspired a large number of guns in the late 20th and early 21st century, even though really no one adopted it itself. After selling off rights to the AR-15, Armalite would work on the AR-16 and then the AR-18. Like the AR-15, the AR-18 was chambered for .223 5.56. But whereas the AR-15 was made to be as light and inexpensive to produce as possible without sacrificing, the AR-18 took it a step further. This has a stamped receiver, and in most of the major parts, including the trigger group, are stamped. It still uses a rotating bolt, very similar to the AR-15, but it's in a square carrier that rides on two guide rails with two recoil springs in the receiver. This would allow it to have a true folding stock, unlike the AR-15, because we don't have a recoil spring in the back. This is much lighter than most AR-15s today because of the stamped steel. It feeds from very similar but different magazines, usually of 20, sometimes of 40 rounds. We have a very similar selector. Interestingly, it's replicated on the right side as well, so an early ambidextrous selector. We have a pretty ergonomic pistol grip. These guns were developed in the 60s. Many militaries would shop them around, try them out, but really no one would adopt them. But they started to be tested out in the mid-60s, and by 68, Armalite was offering these commercially. Both the AR-18 for qualified buyers and the AR-180 for people just needing a semi-auto. Again, we have a folding stock, ergonomic grip. We have an early version of a scope mount here. Obviously this is long before Picatinny or even Weaver, but it is a QD style scope mount. We have a dust cover. We have a a cocking handle that's upswept so you can grab it from either side, though obviously it's more comfortable from the right. We have a last round hold open as we would on an AR-15. We have an 18-inch barrel, so a little bit shorter than on the AR. 3-prong flash hider. But really why the AR-18's out today is the gas system. This uses a short stroke gas piston, which in and of itself isn't that remarkable, but it's the variation, the styling that they did with this. It's a self-regulating system. It's very easy to clean, very, very reliable, and that would lead to this gun being copied by so many people. Not play-for-play copy, but the system itself. The gas system would appear in many later guns because it's just an awesome gas system. Some people would even copy the bolt group as well. So while this gun wasn't adopted by many people, it inspired a whole generation of guns. Pretty much anything designed in the 70s and 80s would take some cues from the AR-18. Some of these would include, of course, the British L85A1. This gun here is actually made in Britain. It was made under contract by Sterling for Armalite. And when Britain was designing the L85 Bullpup, they would pretty much copy the gas system and the bolt group whole cloth from the AR-18. You will also see the Japanese Type 89 taking a great deal of inspiration from this gun. And again, Howa had produced under license for Armalite a version of this rifle in Japan, so it's not surprising that that happened there. You will see this start to influence more recent guns. For example, the H&K G36, which came about in the early 90s, and even the H&K 416 uses a very similar gas system to this. So it had a huge amount of impact, and unfortunately was not commercially successful for Armalite much. Not many of these were produced, about 25,000 total, including full autos. Sterling would build about half, but it had a huge influence. I've often said this was the velvet underground of the gun world. It wasn't popular in its day, but it really inspired a whole group of people. And so you'll see elements of the AR-18 pop up in so many guns. We have quite a famous gun here. The Austrian Steyr STG-77, more often known as the AUG or AUG. This went into development in the very late 60s, so about the time the Armalite AR-180 was coming out full bore, but it's not really inspired much by it. This was Austria's own take, and it was a weapon they worked on for nearly a decade, and it shows. Previous to this, they had adopted a licensed production version of the FAL known as the STG Sturmgewehr 58, and it was pretty much your typical FAL. It did feature a bipod and had a few other unique things and a really good flash hider, but it was a copy basically that Steyr was producing. For their next gun, they wanted to go futuristic, and boy did they. This gun too really pushed the boundaries. The Bullpup concept goes back a long way. Certainly to the end of World War II with the British EM2, but even really before that. But really it never achieved success for one reason or another. A bullpup is an exercise in compromises. It allows a gun to be much shorter and to some extent have a better balance than a standard rifle. This is because the action, the bolt, the recoil system, and the magazine are all housed in the buttstock. You see, without a mag in it, this looks like a pretty standard buttstock. But all your actions back here, pistol grips here, even your hammer and trigger are all back here, of course, because your bolt is. Pistol grip is up here with the trigger, actual trigger here, and all of this is barrel. So there's not really much in the front except the barrel and the gas system. This gun is quite compact, and we have a 20-inch barrel with a flash hider on it. Now this does fire the then very new 223 round. It was coming quite into vogue in the 70s. It uses a short stroke gas piston. It has a small piston located up here. It's also one of the earlier guns to have an adjustable gas system for 223. You would see adjustable gas in the FAL for 7.62 NATO. This is one of the first guns to really have it for this cartridge. This taps a long rod which pushes this bolt carrier back. We have a multi-lug rotating bolt, very much like on an AR. We have an AUG trigger. That's the downfall of a bullpup. Because you have a linkage all from here all the way back to here for your trigger, these are notoriously not great triggers. Now the AUG uses a straight back trigger like a 1911 because you're pushing on a hammer to release it. The magazine would be held back here. These typically fed from synthetic magazines, made of translucent polymer, 30 rounds. They also made an extended 42 round for use as a light machine gun, but the common infantry rifle held 30. The AR-15 pioneered using alloys and polymer furniture, but the AUG took it to the next level. This whole stock is a piece of polymer, as is this folding foregrip. And you have a receiver casting here made out of an aluminum alloy. The early versions, even this optic was part of it. This is not a removable optic. And that's another thing that the AUG pioneered, was making an optic standard, not only for specialists, on a standard infantry assault rifle. This is just a 1.5 power, but it does have minor magnification. It is adjustable. It is lightweight. So it had quite a few benefits, and it was very futuristic for when it was adopted in 1977. I can easily prove this because looking at it today, it doesn't look out of place, does it? Look at anything else adopted in 1977, it usually looks very outdated. This still looks quite modern. It wasn't the end-all and be-all of guns, but it did finally prove that a bullpup could be successful. It has a lot of other neat features too, like quick-to-changing barrels. This is interesting because it introduced the whole idea of a modular gun. Typically, the original military gun would have a 20-inch barrel, but Steyr would also make a 16-inch carbine barrel, a 24-inch heavier LMG barrel, and even a 14-inch kind of CQB type barrel. Some people say 13-inch, 14, 13, you get the idea. And they would also take advantage of the QD barrel system to introduce a 9mm conversion kit. So the AUG began the whole modular system. Now, of course, we still don't have Picatinny rails or anything. We still have a fixed optic on this. But it was definitely a major step forward from an FAL to this in Austria. As much so as the step from the M14 to the AR-15 in America. So they're really pushing it forward. The synthetic mags used by this were also quite a far step forward. Keep in mind, they weren't just polymer, they were see-through polymer, which is something that's only more or less recently appeared in modern production mags for the AR and AK. This is also very easy to disassemble and so on and so forth. But at the cost of a trigger, and for the day and time this was made in, they were quite expensive to produce. They certainly were expensive to research. It took them 10 years to come up with this. But once they released it, it was very successful. It was very reliable for what it was. Not many nations outside of Austria adopted a bullpup at the time. France would do its FAMAS in 1978. A few nations would test the AUG. And some, like Australia, would purchase production rights. Many others would just purchase these in small numbers for their special forces. But it is definitely an interesting part in the history of the assault rifle. It's not to say that everyone started to go to bullpups in the 80s, but it at least proved the concept was solid. Again, this is the A1. The A2 version, Steyr would release about a decade later in the late 80s. It would have a removable optic with the kind of a proprietary mount. So you get away from the fixed optic. That was nice. They would also introduce an external bolt release. And really even the current production A3s are extremely similar to this gun here. They just have a few important but relatively minor updates, and they're still considered a valid military weapon. Well, we had two AKs out, so it only seems fitting to have two AR variants out. And this is a major step forward here. This is a Colt 6921, which is the semi-auto version of the M4 Carbine. The M16A1 is very similar to that SP1 you saw. In the 80s, they would introduce some changes. Heavier barrel, more finely adjustable sights, some ergonomic tweaks. This would be the M16A2. And keep in mind, America was a very early adopter of 223. So by the 80s, most NATO members were just getting into having a 223 rifle. So a lot of those guns at that time were in some ways more advanced than what America was using. So we have the A2 come out, but it still has a 20-inch barrel. It's heavier than the A1 because of a lot of the changes. In Vietnam, there were some AR-15 carbines, often called CAR-15. They were mostly of the XM177 or GAL-5 series. They would have 11-inch barrels. They were much lighter weight. They would have telescoping stocks. But the military didn't acquire a whole lot of them. They were always a specialist weapon. Well, throughout the 70s and 80s, Colt would make small numbers of what they would call the M16A1 and later the M16A2 carbine. These would go up to having a 14.5-inch barrel. And they would contribute to the M4. The M4 is pretty much a collection of updates and changes needed to the M16 to keep it current. Now this would appear in several different guises early on. It wasn't just like they jumped from one to the other. It was an incremental thing. It was officially adopted as the M4 in 1995. One of the major differences we will have with this in full auto would actually be not full auto. The M16A1 was full auto or semi. The A2 rifle introduced semi or 3-round burst. The M4 would continue this with 3-round burst. And 3-round burst or 2-round burst, or in some rare cases 4-round, burst modes were becoming more and more popular in the 80s and 90s. Several reasons, some disagree, but the idea was to conserve ammo, keep things more controllable, so on and so forth. Interestingly, in more recent times, we've gone back to full auto in most guns. But at the time, 3-round burst was considered an update and improvement, as were some heavier barrels and whatnot. The M4 is really the grandson of the XM177. We have a 14.5-inch barrel. This one has a pinned-on flash hider for legal reasons. Still have a direct impingement gas system. It's shorter. Medium profile barrel. This one has the carry handle, but you can remove it to reveal a Picatinny rail. The earliest M4s did not have removable carry handles. However, extremely early on, they would go to this because by the late 90s, optics were becoming more and more common. Remember that Steyr AUG introduced it, and really Canada pushed the AR-15 platform to have optics. It's just the time. Electronics were getting cheaper and smaller and more durable, and glass was becoming more precision made. It was the right time to introduce optic as a standard gun. You would go from the original 2-position stock of the XM177 to a 4-position on the M4. And most of you guys, like the SP1, know this. These are the original handguards. Later we would go to rails. But the M4 I brought out because it shows the idea of compactness. Full-length rifles started to fall out of favor. Full-length assault rifles, I should say, started to fall out of favor. More and more militaries were going to compact guns. The AUG, for example, well, the standard version has a 20-inch barrel. The 16 was becoming more and more common for specialist use. Russia would do the AKS-74U crank with an 8-inch barrel. They thought this was a little too short, so then they kind of reversed it and went to a 12-inch barrel with the AK-105. Israel, who did the Galil, originally with an 18-inch barrel, would go to the SAR with a 13. Now, to be fair to Israel, this was an early version, so they got the idea early on that short was good. And just so on and so forth. You know, you start to see more and more guns And this was in response to more urban fighting, the idea of what was, where the gun was needed. Longer range fire was reserved for more specialist DMR type roles. But the M4 became standard issue and it replaced the older M16A2 and even the more updated A4 over time. It took quite a while, with the Marines being the last holdouts. But today, short carbines such as this are the standard. And while this one's not tacked out with a lot of rails, as most all of you know, your modern guns are going to have railed handguards around the top and an optic. This is my more traditional M4. I do have an M4A1 clone that's more modernized, but I only had room for one on the couch, so this is the one I picked because I love the classic M4 appearance, frankly. And that really heralded in the 21st century generation of assault rifles. I wish I'd had more space and time to bring out several, but I picked one, so I picked one that doesn't appear in a lot of videos. This is my Beretta ARX100. This is the Italian current issue weapon. It's the semi-auto only version of the ARX160. We're still firing 5.56 NATO. And this is a very modern gun. This really is an example of the 21st century, Generation 3, some call it, which you could argue was kicked off by the FN SCAR, which began development around 2004, 2005, and was in full swing by 2008, 2009. And the idea was modularity, lightweight, ease and cost effectiveness of production, durability, reliability, pretty much the whole enchilada. So you'll see the newer version guns. We'll just start off. This one has the 16-inch barrel, 16.5, which is the longer length for the ARX. They also do a 10.5-inch barrel. So you're starting to see the short barrel becoming standard on these guns, the newer guns. We have a gas system with a couple of positions, one for suppressor, one without, or one for adverse and one without. We're using a modified AR-18 gas piston. It's not the same, but it's definitely inspired by the AR-18, so we're using a gas piston system. We have a bolt with rotating lugs, very common by today's standards. We have Picatinny rails. We've got a short one under here, two intermediate length side ones, and a full length top rail. These do come with backup sights, but they're literally just for backup use. A modern gun such as this is expected to be used with an optic, be it magnified or just a red dot. Also, a modern gun like this is expected to be ambidextrous. A lot of your older guns weren't, or were kind of halfway ambidextrous, like the AUG or the AR-15. One of the changes they made with the A2 was to add the brass deflector to help with left-hand shooting, but something like the ARX160 is completely ambi. This charging handle is reversible. That's a very common feature on modern guns. The mag catch is replicated, as is the bolt release on both sides. Yeah. We even have a bottom one here. The safety is on both sides. Sling swivels are located on both sides. Now this one actually has swivels. A lot of your new guns will even just use QD slots, so this is kind of, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't situation. This takes standard AR-15 magazines, which is becoming a de facto standard throughout NATO. Has a typical A2 grip, has a storage compartment in the grip. Storage on these guns is very common. This is a Beretta foregrip. Again, foregrips are quite common on newer guns. It has a QD sling here, or quick release buckles, which is a common feature. Another common feature is a folding stock. It's also adjustable. This one, of course, folds over to the right. It also has 3 positions to set the length of pull. This one's pretty short even for me, but that gives you the idea. Most of your newer guns were going to have both of these features, and many even have an adjustable cheek riser here for use with your optic. Finally, one reason I picked this one over, say, the CZ805, modern guns are going to have polymer construction. There's very little steel in these. You pretty much have your bolt, your barrel, and you have some reinforcement and guide rails inside the receiver. Now that, because the receiver is polymer, does mean that it looks a little chunky. However, it's very lightweight. This weighs about the same, maybe just a little bit more than the old XM177 carbine, and has a lot more to feature. Plus, this polymer is easier to produce by modern standards, with modern advanced tooling and equipment with precision. It's very rust and weather resistant. And it's very soldier proof. And also you can make it very ergonomic with curves and stuff to suit your needs. Like my hand grip up here is a very comfortable hand grip. This is also a removable panel for a grenade launcher attachment. Interestingly to this gun, it has quick detaching barrel even. The AUG did as well. Some of your newer guns do. Most of them have a barrel that's much easier to remove than the older guns. This again was introduced by the FN SCAR, although its barrel needed to have 6 screws removed and then put back in precisely. With something like the ARX, you just pull down this latch and the barrel pulls right out. Same on the Steyr AUG, there's just a button. So the newer guns tend to have barrels that come out much easier than the older guns. And that's so they can be configured for specific missions. Also caliber conversions. Beretta does make this in several other calibers. 7.6239 has been made in quite large numbers to fulfill a contract in Kazakhstan. And they've talked about doing some other calibers in 6.5 this or 6.8 that, so on and so forth, 300 blackout. It gives them a lot more modularity and flexibility. So yeah, that's why I chose the ARX100 to represent the modern generation. If you notice, this is not a bullpup. It's still a traditional rifle layout. Bullpups have been modestly successful, but a lot of nations still prefer the better trigger of a rifle and just the familiarity. Plus, if you have a true folding stock, unlike an AR that has a collapsible, it lets the gun still be very compact. But bullpups have been used and still are. Britain still uses the L85, now they're up to the A2. Australia uses the F88 and will probably be transitioning over to the F90 very soon, which is an updated version of the Steyr AUG. Probably the most famous user is Israel, where IWI has developed the Tavor. It was actually one of the earlier developments in bullpups after the AUG. I mean, it came much later, but it's one of the next successful ones, truly. The FAMAS never really took off outside of France. They'd work on the Tavor beginning around the turn of the century, turn of the millennium. They would first introduce the TAR-21. It would have an 18-inch barrel as standard. They would do a carbine version, the CTAR, with a 15-inch barrel. And they would do an MTAR, a micro Tavor, with a 13-inch barrel. Well, of these, the short barrel versions were much more successful and popular. And this ultimately led to not the TAR-21 being adopted as standard in the IDF, but rather the X95 in 2009, and then updated in 2014, and it would be a takeoff from the micro or the CTAR, like we're talking about with the M4. Shorter barrels seem to be more popular. The micro Tavor 13-inch barrel would turn into the X95. It would have some ergonomic updates, more rails added. Then, more recently, they would extend it out to 15 inches because they were having some trouble with 13. So they've used both sizes in the X95. And it just goes to show you where the modern gun's at. You know, wanting a barrel in that mid-range there. In the past, they did try shorter barrels, 8, 9, 10 inches. That's too short for a standard issue, a GI rifle. But there seems to be a sweet spot in the 12 to 15 inch range that most militaries have settled upon now. These days, some rifles are being made in 7.62 NATO, but these are for specialists. They're more DMRs. Your standard issue assault rifles that are expected to be used in either semi or full auto are chambered in 5.56 for most of the world. Russia still uses the 5.45, which is, you know, an analog, and China is doing its own thing with the 5.8. Again, but it's a very close analog. This seems to be where we're at with the current generations. We have a lot of polymers in use. We have a lot of rails. Optics have become standard issue, not just optional. Common mags, usually with AR-15 mags, are standard, although a few guns like the 805 A1 in use in Czech Republic use their own mags, although they can easily be updated to use AR-15. Again, the modularity makes these guns very flexible and adaptable, and that seems to be the hallmark of having so many rails and easily removable and configurable parts. Now, the problem is, while someone like Italy could adopt the ARX160 because their previous gun, which was the AR70-90, was pretty not dated. I mean, it wasn't adopted until 1990, but it was made with all metal. It was a full length. America has the M4, and really none of these guns offer a huge distinct advantage, and they're still all firing the same cartridge. So this is why America, and for that matter Russia, haven't really gone to anything terribly new. They'll go to a new variant, new configuration, but there hasn't been a huge leap forward in all this technology really since the 60s and 70s, with some minor exceptions. So just to kind of review what we've gone over here, you know, going all the way back, we've got the not assault rifle M2. We've got the first successful, some people might argue otherwise, but it was the one that everyone pretty much acknowledges, the MP44, the Sturmgewehr, which is where we get the name assault rifle from in the first place. No, it was not actually liberal media that coined the term, it was Hitler. So then, of course, we have the AK, which really took the assault rifle concept and ran with it, and is arguably the most successful, famous, and widely produced version of all time. And of course, it took with it the 7.62 cartridge, which you could say was the first successful intermediate cartridge to be around the world. We have the NATO guns. Unfortunately, they're all hampered by being in 7.62 NATO. The cartridge was the problem. The FAL is a beautiful gun, but it's a little expensive and time-consuming to produce, especially by today's standards, milled receivers and all that. The SETME G3 was much cheaper and faster to produce, lighter weight, but again, not really controllable much in full auto. The M14 is the M14. It looks good as a drill gun. It can have a very nice trigger. They can be accurized, but I can't really think of many real great advantages that it has that other guns didn't. It didn't really do anything better than anyone else. Again, accuracy maybe, but to get these to really be accurate, you have to really tune them and keep them tuned, and that's not as easy to do because of how you have to take the action out of the stock to clean it. So that was thankfully just kind of a dead end there. The AR-15 has been around for over 50 years and is still influencing today. I mean, there's so much to be said about it, but it started a whole new standard. From the cartridge it fired, to the materials it was made from, to just the whole concept. I mean, this was finally something that could compete with the AK, a gun that was reasonable to fire in automatic, because these weren't. You know, and then obviously it was a good idea because Russia copied it. So when your adversary thinks it, you know, copies you, that has to tell you something good. And it also shows their concept is still solid. The operating system is an AK, and they've managed to make it cheaper and lighter. Still in use today, just in slightly updated form. The AR-18, as I said, was never really used by anyone. I know someone in the comments will say the Irish, the IRA, that's not an official military, and I don't want to get into politics here. But aside from that, this introduced a lot of concepts which would be expanded upon, from a more ergonomic grip, ambidextrous safety, a quick detaching scope mount, stamped receiver, folding stock. I mean, it really, if you look at later guns, man, it had a lot of good ideas. It just was the wrong thing. It wasn't quite as strong as it needed to be, but it could have easily been updated if someone had adopted it. But it's a very neat gun. It's one of the few non-military guns I own. And then of course we get to the Steyr AUG, which we talked about. It takes the concept of having an optic as standard. It gets into some modularity. It has some early left-hand friendly features like left-hand ejection capability. It's not fully ambidextrous, but it's getting there. The safety is also able to be used from either side, as is the mag release. Obviously being made of mostly polymer and having cast metal for the rest of the parts is a forward-thinking notion. And of course the quick change barrel and the magazines it used were actually very similar to a lot of modern AR-15 mags, like Troy Battle mags and Lancers and such. And this gun is still in production today in the A3 format. So shows you where it was at. Probably the most successful bullpup before the Tavor, and arguably still so. Of course, then we get to the M4, which shows the trend towards more rails, shorter size, more and more modularity. It still has a lot of leftovers that aren't terribly left-hand friendly. The AR-15 can only be altered so much to make it lefty friendly, but the brass deflector helps a lot, and newer versions have an ambidextrous safety, and even you can get ambidextrous mag releases. But it just shows the longevity of the AR-15 platform and where it's come, and it's how it's still a valid gun today. This is standard issue in one form or another throughout our military. And then finally ending up with the Arx100, which is just the one I pulled out. These third generation 223 guns, they're being adopted, but you see more models being procured by just like special forces or smaller militaries. Your larger militaries like America and Russia and China have been slower to go to the newer patterns of guns simply because they can keep their older guns running with a few small, inexpensive updates. But something like this represents the newer generations. Again, you could say the H&K 416, certainly the G36 is a polymer gun that fits into this category. The 805 and the 806 Brens fit in, and so on and so forth. But this is just kind of a rundown of the history of the assault rifle, the real thing. Select fire gun firing an intermediate cartridge. Again, I know I missed some stuff, and this was a very general overview, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope, sit down and watch this while having dinner or something. If you liked it, check out our other kind of evolutionary history videos. And if you have any comments, please post them below. If you haven't already subscribed, give us a chance. We have quite a wide range of videos, from long and short and everything in between. Shooting videos too, of course. Well, this is Misha, We appreciate you tuning in and taking the time with us today. And please tune in again next time for another hopefully interesting video. We'll catch you then.